The United States Army deployed a remarkable array of artillery during World War II, from lightweight mortars that infantry squads could carry into the most rugged terrain, to massive coastal guns that hurled shells weighing over a ton across distances measured in miles. This video breaks down every significant artillery piece American forces fielded across 4 years of global warfare. These weapons formed the foundation of American firepower, delivering the majority of explosive ordnance against Axis forces from the beaches of Normandy to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima. Let us begin with mortars, the infantry's own artillery. The 60mm M2 mortar was the lightest indirect fire weapon available to American infantry during the conflict. Development began in the late 1930s when the Army recognized the need for a portable weapon that could drop explosive rounds behind enemy cover. Based on the French Brandt design that had revolutionized mortar technology, the M2 entered service in 1940 and quickly proved its worth. Weighing just 42 pounds complete with its baseplate, bipod and tube, this compact weapon could be carried and operated by a 2-man team. The barrel alone weighed only 12.5 pounds, the mount 7 pounds, and the baseplate 12.5 pounds, making individual components easy to transport even over rough terrain. A skilled crew could fire up to 18 rounds per minute, saturating enemy positions with high explosive fragmentation rounds. Maximum range reached approximately 2,000 yards with the standard M49A2 high-explosive shell, which weighed just under 3 pounds. Each infantry company received 3 of these weapons, giving platoon leaders organic, indirect fire capability without waiting for support from battalion or regimental artillery. The M2 proved particularly valuable in the Pacific Theater, where jungle terrain often prevented larger weapons from reaching forward positions. On Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, and countless other island battlegrounds, the 60mm mortar provided vital fire support when nothing else could reach the fighting. At the Battle of Bloody Ridge on Guadalcanal in September 1942, 60mm mortars helped repel massive Japanese night attacks against Marine positions, dropping illumination rounds that exposed enemy formations to devastating rifle and machine gun fire. Approximately 60,000 M2 mortars were produced during the war years, making it one of the most numerous American weapons of the conflict. The mortar remained in service through the Korean War and beyond, a testament to its simple effectiveness. The 81mm M1 mortar served as the standard medium mortar for American infantry battalions throughout the war. Based on the highly successful French Brandt 81mm design that had set the standard for infantry mortars worldwide, the American version entered service in 1935 following extensive testing and minor modifications for domestic production. The Army had acquired 4 Brandt prototypes in 1931 and, after evaluating their performance, adopted a modified version suited to American manufacturing methods and tactical requirements. The weapon broke down into 3 loads for transport. The tube weighed 44.5 pounds, the bipod mount 46.5 pounds, and the massive circular baseplate another 45 pounds, bringing the total weight to 136 pounds. Despite this considerable burden, infantry battalions valued the M1 for its devastating firepower. The standard M43A1 light high-explosive round weighed nearly 7 pounds and could reach targets over 3,200 yards distant. The fragmentation effect of this round compared favorably with the 75mm howitzer, giving battalion commanders artillery-like effects without requiring divisional fire support. The heavy M45 round packed even more punch at over 15 pounds, with a bursting radius comparable to the 105mm howitzer, though at reduced range of approximately 1,200 yards. Each infantry battalion received 4 M1 mortars organized into a mortar platoon, providing the battalion commander with responsive indirect fire that could be directed against targets within minutes of identification. Sometimes called infantry artillery, or hip pocket artillery, these weapons proved capable of breaking up enemy attacks under the worst conditions. In the Pacific campaigns, the 81mm mortar became indispensable because it could be man-packed into positions where wheeled or tracked artillery simply could not follow. American airborne units parachuted M1 mortars into Normandy, Holland, and across the Rhine. providing immediate heavy fire support before conventional artillery could be brought forward. Production was handled by AB Farquhar Company, Pullman Standard Car Manufacturing, and WWII Arsenal. The M1 could also be mounted in the bed of the M3 half-track, allowing crews to fire from the vehicle without dismounting, providing a mobile fire platform that proved useful in supporting armoured advances. The 4.2-inch M2 chemical mortar represented the heaviest mortar in American service during the war. Originally developed by the Chemical Warfare Service for delivering toxic agents, the weapon was adapted to fire high explosive and smoke rounds when chemical weapons were not employed. Development began in the 1930s, and the weapon entered service with chemical mortar battalions assigned to infantry divisions. The M2 fired a 25-pound projectile to ranges exceeding 4,000 yards, delivering firepower that rivaled conventional artillery. The mortar consisted of a smooth bore tube, a standard baseplate, and a complex rotating mechanism that allowed precise aiming. Total weight in firing. Configuration exceeded 330 pounds, requiring vehicle transport to forward positions. Each infantry division received a chemical mortar battalion equipped with these weapons, typically organized with 4 firing companies of 4 mortars each, providing additional indirect fire capability at the division commander's disposal. The mortar first saw combat during the Sicily campaign in July 1943, where chemical mortar battalions fired over 35,000 rounds in just 38 days of fighting. The weapon's high angle of fire proved particularly effective in the mountainous terrain of Italy and the confined spaces of urban combat in Europe. At the Battle of Aachen in October 1944, 4.2-inch mortars dropped rounds into German positions among the rubble where conventional artillery could not reach. Marines mounted 4.2-inch mortars on modified landing craft designated LCI-M, creating floating mortar platforms that delivered devastating preparatory fires onto invasion beaches across the Pacific. During the assault on Peleliu, these mortar gunboats saturated Japanese defensive positions before the first waves hit the beach. Next on the list is light field artillery, the guns that provided direct support to infantry and armoured formations. The 75mm M1897A4 was an American adaptation of the legendary French 75 that had dominated World War I battlefields. When the United States entered the Great War in 1917, the Army lacked adequate field artillery and adopted the French canon de 75mm as its primary divisional weapon. American arsenals at Rock Island and elsewhere produced thousands of these guns, and improved versions remained in service when World War II began. The M1897A4 featured the revolutionary hydro-pneumatic recoil system that had made the French 75 famous, allowing rapid fire without repositioning the gun between shots. This mechanism absorbed the recoil force through a combination of hydraulic fluid and compressed air, returning the barrel to battery automatically after each shot. A trained crew could fire up to 20 rounds per minute in emergencies, though sustained rates were considerably lower to prevent overheating. The weapon could throw a 15-pound high explosive shell over 8,000 yards, adequate range for direct support missions. Though increasingly obsolescent by 1941, the 75 remained in service with National Guard divisions and training units throughout the early war years. Some saw combat in the Philippines, where they fought alongside the doomed defenders of Bataan and Corregidor. During the desperate fighting on Bataan in early 1942, American and Filipino artillerymen used their 75mm guns until ammunition ran out and the barrels were destroyed to prevent capture. The gun's lightweight and high rate of fire made it useful for certain specialized roles even as heavier weapons took over primary fire support duties. The 75mm M1A1 pack howitzer was designed specifically for airborne and mountain operations where conventional artillery could not follow. This compact weapon could be broken down into 9 separate loads for transport by pack mule or parachute drop. Each component was sized and weighted to be carried by a single mule or dropped in a standard parachute container. Reassembly took a trained crew only minutes under field conditions. Weighing just over 1,300 pounds complete, the pack howitzer fired a 14-pound shell to the ranges exceeding 9,200 yards. The weapon featured a box trail and rubber-tired wheels for short-distance towing, though it was primarily designed for breakdown transport. The Pack howitzer first saw combat with American forces during the North African Campaign in November 1942 and subsequently participated in every major airborne operation of the war. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions jumped with Pack howitzers into Normandy on D-Day, June 6, 1944, providing immediate artillery support during the critical early hours of the invasion. Despite scattered drops that separated crews from their equipment, determined artillerymen assembled their guns and opened fire on German positions within hours of landing. The gun also served extensively in the Pacific, where it could be manhandled through jungle terrain that stopped heavier weapons cold. Marine artillery batteries used Pack howitzers on numerous island assaults where the need for portable firepower outweighed the desire for greater range and shell weight. During the fighting on New Guinea, Pack howitzers were the only artillery that could keep pace with infantry pushing through nearly impassable terrain. The 105mm M2A1 howitzer became the true backbone of American divisional artillery throughout World War II. 1 out of every 5 shells fired by American forces during the entire conflict was a 105mm high explosive round from this weapon. Development traced back to the Westervelt Board of 1919, which studied captured German howitzers and recommended replacing the lighter 75mm guns with heavier weapons capable of delivering more destructive fires. Work proceeded slowly through the 1920s due to limited congressional funding, but the design was standardized in December 1927 as the 105mm howitzer M1 on carriage M1. A modified version using semi-fixed ammunition rather than separate loading rounds was trialled in 1932, becoming the M2. By 1939, only 48 pieces had been manufactured due to budget constraints, but the outbreak of war in Europe spurred massive production increases. The M2A1 featured a split trail carriage designed for motor towing rather than horse transport, reflecting the Army's mechanization efforts. Weighing approximately 4,980 pounds in firing configuration, the howitzer required a crew of 8 and could fire a 33-pound high explosive shell to ranges exceeding 11,200 meters. Rate of fire reached 10 rounds per minute maximum, with 3 rounds per minute sustainable for extended periods. Each standard infantry division received 36 of these weapons, organized into 3 battalions of 12 guns each, with 3 4-gun batteries per battalion. Armored divisions received similar allocations, typically with self-propelled variants. The gun served on every front where American soldiers fought, from the deserts of Tunisia to the frozen forests of the Ardennes, from the beaches of Normandy to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima. During the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, 105mm crews fought in freezing conditions, sometimes firing over open sights at attacking German tanks when the situation became desperate. American industry produced over 8,500 M2A1 howitzers during the war years, with production continuing at Rock Island Arsenal until 1953, and total output exceeding 10,200 units. The weapon earned a reputation for accuracy and reliability that made it beloved by crews and supported units alike. Its design influenced American artillery development for decades afterward, with the basic weapon remaining in service through the Korean and Vietnam Wars before finally being replaced in the 1960s. Let us move on to medium and heavy field artillery, the guns that delivered crushing bombardments at division and corps level. The 155mm M1 howitzer served as the standard heavy howitzer for American divisions throughout the conflict. Each infantry division received 1 battalion of 12 155mm howitzers alongside its 3 battalions of 105mm weapons, providing the division commander with heavier firepower for critical targets. The weapon developed from World War I-era designs, with the M1918 version serving until improved models appeared in the 1930s. The M1 could fire a 95-pound high explosive shell over 16,000 yards, delivering devastating effects against fortified positions, troop concentrations, and enemy artillery batteries. The howitzer required a crew of 11 men and weighed nearly 12,000 pounds in firing position, requiring truck or tractor transport. The standard prime mover was the Mack No. 6-ton truck or the M4 high-speed tractor for armored formations. Setup time from march order to firing position took approximately 15 minutes for a trained crew. Despite its considerable weight and complexity, the 155mm howitzer proved invaluable for general support missions and counter-battery fire. 155mm battalions provided the heavy preparatory fires that preceded major offensives, methodically destroying enemy defensive positions before infantry and armor advanced. During Operation Cobra in July 1944, massed 155mm fire helped blast a hole through German lines west of St. Lo that allowed American armored divisions to break out into open country. Over 10,300 M1 howitzers were produced between 1941 and 1953, with many supplied to Allied nations through Lend-Lease. The 155mm gun M1, universally known as the Long Tom, provided American Corps with exceptional long-range firepower throughout the war. This weapon could throw a 100-pound shell over 14 miles with remarkable accuracy, outranging virtually every enemy artillery piece it faced. Development traced back to World War I when American forces adopted the French Canon de 155mm GPF. Post-war studies led to improvements that eventually produced the M1. Standardized in 1938 with only 20 examples initially built due to budget limitations. The weapon featured an 8-wheel bogie and 2-wheel limber for high-speed highway transport, with the barrel and carriage traveling as separate loads for the heaviest variants. The Long Tom first entered combat on December 24, 1942, when Battery A of the 36th Field Artillery Regiment opened fire during the North African campaign against German positions near Medjez el Bab in Tunisia. The weapon subsequently equipped 33 corps-level artillery battalions in the European and Mediterranean theatres and 8 battalions in the Pacific. The gun's extreme range allowed it to strike targets far behind enemy lines while remaining beyond the reach of counter-battery fire. During the Italian campaign, Long Toms engaged German headquarters, supply dumps, and rail junctions from distances that made effective response nearly impossible. A qualified crew of 15 men could fire more than 40 rounds per hour, maintaining continuous harassment of enemy rear areas. The weapon required substantial prime movers for transport, typically the M4 high-speed tractor, but its long reach and heavy shell made it invaluable for deep strike missions. British forces received 184 Long Toms through Lend-Lease, employing them alongside their own heavy artillery in Italy and northwest Europe. 2 Long Toms operating near Anzio in 1944 became famous among Allied troops as Anzio Annie's nemesis, dueling with German railway guns that shelled the beachhead. The 8-inch howitzer M1 delivered the heaviest shells regularly available to American Corps artillery commanders. This massive weapon fired a 200-pound projectile over 18,000 yards, producing devastating effects against fortifications and troop concentrations that lighter weapons could not match. The howitzer shared its carriage with the 155mm Long Tom, simplifying logistics and maintenance for Corps artillery units, as crews could be trained on both weapons with minimal additional instruction. Development began during the 1930s as part of the same program that produced the Long Tom, and the weapon entered production alongside its longer-ranged counterpart. The 8-inch projectile could penetrate reinforced concrete bunkers that shrugged off 155mm shells, making it the weapon of choice against the strongest German fortifications. Each heavy artillery battalion typically included both 8-inch howitzers and Long Toms, giving commanders flexibility in engaging different target types. 8-inch howitzer battalions provided corps commanders with firepower capable of reducing fortified positions that had withstood everything lighter. During the reduction of German fortifications along the Siegfried Line in late 1944 and early 1945, 8-inch howitzers systematically demolished concrete bunkers and pillboxes that smaller caliber weapons could merely chip. The high trajectory allowed shells to plunge through overhead cover that protected German positions from flat trajectory fire. The 8-inch gun M1 offered even greater range than the howitzer, firing its 240-pound shell over 35,000 yards. This exceptional reach allowed corps and army commanders to engage targets deep in enemy rear areas while remaining beyond effective counter-battery range. The gun required substantial resources to transport and emplace, but its combination of range and hitting power made it invaluable for strategic missions. Few were produced, but those that reached the front made their presence felt. The 240mm howitzer M1, nicknamed the Black Dragon by its crews for the enormous cloud of smoke and flame that accompanied each shot, was the largest mobile artillery piece deployed by American forces during the war. This massive weapon fired a 360-pound shell over 14 miles, delivering devastating effects against the heaviest fortifications. The howitzer required a crew of 14 men and substantial prime movers to transport its components, which arrived at the firing position in 2 separate loads. The barrel travelled on a special transporter, while the carriage moved separately. Assembly at the firing position took considerable time and effort, but once in place, the Black Dragon could reduce fortifications that had withstood everything else in the American arsenal. The weapon first entered combat in Italy during the Anzio campaign in early 1944, where its heavy shells proved capable of cracking German bunkers that had resisted all lighter artillery. The psychological effect on enemy troops was considerable, as the 240mm shell produced a distinctive sound that German soldiers learned to dread. In the Pacific, 240mm howitzers engaged Japanese fortifications on heavily defended positions. During operations around Manila in February 1945, Black Dragon howitzers helped reduce Japanese positions in heavily fortified areas. Only limited numbers were produced due to the enormous resources each weapon consumed, but those that reached combat proved their worth against the toughest targets. Continuing with anti-tank guns, the specialized weapons developed to stop enemy armor. The 37mm gun M3 was the first dedicated anti-tank weapon fielded by American forces in significant numbers. Development began in January 1937, following reports from the Spanish Civil War that demonstrated the effectiveness of similar German weapons against tanks. The Ordnance Department studied the German PaK-36 and developed an American version, modified for domestic production methods and ammunition. The design went through several prototype iterations, with the M10 gun and T5 carriage eventually selected for production as the M3 gun on M4 carriage. The weapon entered service in 1940 and rapidly equipped the anti-tank platoons of infantry regiments, with each battalion receiving 3 guns and each regiment receiving an additional 9 in the regimental anti-tank company. Weighing just over 900 pounds, the weapon could be towed by a standard jeep and manhandled into position by its crew of 4 to 6 soldiers. The low silhouette, only about the height of a seated man, made concealment relatively easy. The gun fired armor-piercing rounds capable of penetrating approximately 60 millimeters of armor at 500 yards, adequate against the light tanks of the early war period. Against Japanese armor, which remained relatively thin throughout the conflict, the 37mm proved effective until the end of the war. Japanese Type 95 and Type 97 tanks fell victim to 37mm fire throughout the Pacific campaigns. The canister round, containing 122 3/8-inch steel balls, made the weapon devastating against infantry at close range, essentially functioning as a giant shotgun. At the Battle of Bloody Ridge on Guadalcanal, Marine 37mm crews fired canister into massed Japanese infantry attacks, shredding assault waves before they could close with American positions. However, combat in Tunisia revealed the gun's inadequacy against German medium and heavy tanks. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, 37mm rounds bounced harmlessly off Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, leading frustrated crews to nickname the weapon the Army Door Knocker. Observers reported that some crews fired entire ammunition, supplies at approaching German tanks without achieving a single penetration. Over 18,700 M3 guns were produced, making it the most numerous American anti-tank gun of the war despite its obvious limitations against modern German armor. Production peaked in 1942 at over 11,000 guns before declining as newer weapons entered service. The 57mm gun M1 replaced the inadequate 37mm as the standard American anti-tank weapon, beginning in 1943. This weapon was an American-produced version of the British 6-pounder, adopted because it offered a quantum leap in anti-armor capability while using a proven design already in production. The British had developed the 6-pounder before the war, but delayed production to continue manufacturing 2-pounder guns, a decision they later regretted. American production began in 1942 at WWII arsenal and other facilities. The M1 could penetrate approximately 70 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards with standard ammunition, giving it a fighting chance against German medium tanks at reasonable combat ranges. Special tungsten core ammunition improved penetration significantly but remained in short supply. Each infantry regiment eventually received 9 57mm guns to replace its 37mm weapons, though shortages meant the transition was not complete until mid-1944 in many units. The gun weighed approximately 2,700 pounds, substantially heavier than its predecessor, requiring truck transport rather than jeep towing. Crew size increased to 6 men. Despite its improved penetration, the 57mm struggled against the frontal armor of Panthers and Tigers, forcing crews to seek flank and rear shots against these formidable opponents. At the Battle of the Bulge, 57mm crews fought desperately against German armor, sometimes at point-blank range in foggy conditions that negated the advantages of heavier weapons. The weapon served effectively in the Pacific, where Japanese armor posed far less challenge than German tanks and remained useful in Europe for engaging lighter vehicles and fortifications. The 3-inch gun M5 provided American forces with a genuinely powerful anti-tank capability when it entered service during 1943. This weapon fired a 15-pound armor-piercing round at high velocity, penetrating approximately 90 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards with standard ammunition, though special hypervelocity armor-piercing rounds could achieve significantly higher penetration when available. Development traced back to anti-aircraft guns of similar caliber, modified for the anti-tank role. The M5 equipped the M10 tank destroyer, giving American armored units a weapon capable of engaging German medium tanks on relatively equal terms. The towed version served with anti-tank battalions, though its weight of over 4,600 pounds limited mobility and made it difficult to emplace quickly. Tank destroyer doctrine called for massed employment of M10s against enemy armor concentrations, using speed and firepower to defeat tank attacks. Against Panther tanks, the 3-inch gun could achieve penetrations at moderate ranges with carefully aimed shots, though it still struggled against the heaviest German armor from frontal aspects. The weapon represented a significant improvement over earlier American anti-tank guns and served until superseded by 90mm weapons in the final year of the war. The 90mm gun M3 was the most powerful anti-tank weapon regularly employed by American forces during the war. Derived from the 90mm anti-aircraft gun that had proven its worth against high-altitude bombers, this weapon could penetrate over 120mm of armor at 1,000 yards with standard ammunition, making it effective against virtually any German tank at normal combat ranges. Hypervelocity armor-piercing ammunition improved this performance further. The M3 equipped the M36 tank destroyer and the M26 Pershing heavy tank, giving American armored forces weapons capable of taking on Tigers and Panthers with confidence. A T-26E4 experimental tank armed with a high-velocity 90mm gun destroyed a German heavy tank at a range of over 1,400 meters during fighting along the Weser River in April 1945. The gun fired the same ammunition as the heavy anti-aircraft weapons, simplifying supply arrangements. Against Japanese armor, the 90mm was massive overkill, but it proved invaluable for destroying bunkers and fortifications throughout the Pacific campaign. The weapon remained in American service long after World War II, equipping tanks through the Korean War and beyond. Next on the list is anti-aircraft artillery, the guns that defended American forces from increasingly desperate Axis air attacks. The 40mm M1 Bofors became the standard medium anti-aircraft weapon for American forces during the war after demonstrating clear superiority over the domestic 37mm M1 gun. Developed in Sweden during the early 1930s by Bofors AB, the weapon achieved international recognition as the finest light anti-aircraft gun of its era. 19 countries were producing licensed versions before the war began. The United States obtained examples for testing in December 1940 after a diplomatic effort involving British, Swedish, and Finnish cooperation. A twin-mounted Bofors gun travelled secretly by truck the entire length of Sweden before being loaded aboard the transport American Legion at the Finnish port of Petsamo, one of the last neutral ships to depart before German forces closed the route. Testing at Dahlgren, Virginia, convinced American ordnance officers of the weapon's superiority, and production contracts were issued in June 1941. By the middle of the war, the Bofors had replaced the 37mm gun in most American anti-aircraft units. The weapon fired a 2-pound explosive shell at cyclic rates approaching 120 rounds per minute for Army ground versions and up to 160 rounds per minute for naval mounts, creating a wall of steel that low-flying aircraft had to penetrate. Ammunition was fed in 4-round clips that skilled loaders could change rapidly. Effective ceiling reached approximately 23,000 feet, while maximum horizontal range exceeded 11,000 yards. Each anti-aircraft artillery automatic weapons battalion operated 32 40mm guns organized into 4 firing batteries, supplemented by multiple 50-caliber machine gun mounts for close-in defense. Marine divisions included special weapons battalions with 16 Bofors guns for air defense of beachheads and forward positions. The Navy mounted Bofors guns on virtually every warship larger than a patrol craft, with Iowa-class battleships carrying 80 barrels in twin and quadruple mounts. Against kamikaze attacks in the Pacific during 1944 and 1945, massed Bofors fire provided the last line of defense that saved countless ships from destruction. The weapon's 2-pound shell could destroy or disable aircraft with a single hit, unlike smaller caliber weapons that often required multiple impacts. The 90mm guns M1, M1A1, and M2 served as the primary heavy anti-aircraft weapons for American forces throughout the conflict. Developed during the late 1930s to replace the aging 3-inch anti-aircraft gun, the 90mm entered production in 1940. The M1 was standardized in March 1940, with the improved M1A1 following in May 1941. The weapon could fire a 23-pound shell to maximum altitudes exceeding 43,000 feet, engaging high-altitude bombers that lighter weapons could not reach. When controlled by the SCR-584 radar and connected to the M9 fire control computer, the 90mm achieved remarkable accuracy against aircraft targets. The M1A1 incorporated a spring rammer on the breech that increased rate of fire to 20 rounds per minute. Several thousand M1A1 guns were available when America entered the war, and production rates eventually reached several thousand per month. The M2 version, standardized in May 1943, introduced the ability to depress the gun to -10 degrees for anti-tank use, along with a large shield protecting the crew and an automatic fuse setter rammer. This dual-purpose capability made the 90mm comparable to the famous German 88mm flak gun. Each heavy anti-aircraft artillery battalion operated 16 90mm guns in 4 batteries. Against German V-1 flying bombs attacking Antwerp in the winter of 1944-45, batteries of 90mm guns achieved devastating effectiveness, with one particularly successful weak-reaching kill rates of 94%. Destroying over 2,183 missiles during the 4-month defensive campaign. American forces expended over 532,000 rounds of 90mm ammunition defending Antwerp alone, wearing out multiple sets of gun tubes in the process. The 90mm also proved effective in ground combat roles, engaging enemy tanks and fortifications when the tactical situation demanded. Its armor-piercing capability allowed it to defeat any German tank at ranges where enemy weapons could not respond effectively. The 120mm M1 gun provided defense against the highest-flying enemy aircraft. This massive weapon could engage targets at altitudes exceeding 14,000 meters, where smaller caliber guns proved ineffective. The 120mm defended only the most critical strategic targets in the continental United States and overseas bases, including aircraft factories, port facilities, and major headquarters installations. The weapon required substantial resources to transport and emplace, and relatively few were produced compared to the 90mm. Those that entered service formed the backbone of heavy air defense for irreplaceable installations. Let us move on to self-propelled artillery, the mobile guns that could keep pace with armored formations. The 105mm howitzer motor carriage M7, universally known as the Priest, became the standard self-propelled artillery for American armored divisions throughout the war. British troops bestowed the nickname after noting that the ring-mounted 50-caliber machine gun position resembled a church pulpit, continuing their tradition of naming American self-propelled guns after religious figures following the bishop and deacon. Development began in June 1941, when Army observers recognized the need for fully tracked armored artillery that could support tank operations across rough terrain. Earlier experiments with howitzers mounted on half-tracks, including the T-19 howitzer motor carriage, had demonstrated that such vehicles lacked adequate protection and cross-country mobility. Major General Jacob Devers, chief of the armored force, championed the requirement for a proper self-propelled howitzer. The M7 mounted the standard M2A1 105mm howitzer on the chassis of the M3 Lee medium tank, later transitioning to M4 Sherman components as that tank entered mass production. The prototype T-32 was completed by Baldwin Locomotive Works and tested at Aberdeen Proving Ground before being accepted for service as the M7 in February 1942. The vehicle carried 69 rounds of ammunition and required a crew of 7, including the driver, commander, gunner, and 4 ammunition handlers. Armor protection reached 51mm at the thickest point. Maximum road speed reached 26 miles per hour, allowing the Priest to keep pace with advancing armor formations, while cross-country speed of 15 miles per hour exceeded most towed artillery's ability to follow. The weapon first entered combat during the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942, when 90 M7s supported British forces in North Africa. British observers concluded the M7 was a great success despite logistical complications from its American ammunition. American armored divisions received 3 battalions of M7s each, providing 54 self-propelled howitzers per division. Total production by American Locomotive Company and Pressed Steel Car Company reached over 4,300 vehicles, including the improved M7B1 variant, based on the M4A3 Sherman chassis. The Priest served on every front where American armor fought, from the deserts of Tunisia through the hedgerows of Normandy and into the heart of Germany. British forces converted surplus M7s into Kangaroo armoured personnel carriers after receiving the Canadian-built Sexton, which fired British standard ammunition and simplified their supply chain. The 75mm howitzer motor carriage M8 provided American reconnaissance and light armoured units with mobile fire support in a compact package. This vehicle mounted a 75mm howitzer in an open-topped turret on the M5 Stuart light tank chassis. Though limited in range and shell weight compared to heavier self-propelled guns, the M8 proved valuable for its mobility and availability to units that needed organic artillery support. Cavalry reconnaissance squadrons received M8s to provide immediate indirect fire during scouting operations. The vehicle saw extensive service in both European and Pacific theaters, where its light weight allowed it to operate in terrain that stopped heavier self-propelled guns. The 155mm gun motor carriage M12 provided American forces with mobile heavy artillery capable of accompanying armored advances. This vehicle mounted the World War I-era 155mm gun M1917 or M1918 on a modified M3 tank chassis. Development began in 1941 as a way to utilize stocks of older guns that remained serviceable. Only about 100 were built, primarily by Pressed Steel Car Company, but they proved valuable during the campaign in northwest Europe. The M12 could deliver 95-pound shells against fortifications and strong points that lighter weapons could not reduce. During the assault on the German frontier in late 1944, M12s engaged concrete bunkers of the Siegfried Line at close range, blasting holes through fortifications that had withstood conventional artillery fire. The vehicle's open fighting compartment left crews vulnerable to small arms and shell fragments, but its devastating firepower made it worth the risk in siege operations. Crews developed tactics of advancing under cover, firing a few rounds at point-blank range, and then withdrawing before enemy response could be organized. The 155mm gun motor carriage M40 represented the improved successor to the M12, mounting the long tom on a widened Sherman chassis. This vehicle entered production late in the war and saw limited but effective service during the final months of fighting in Europe. The M40 combined the long tom's exceptional range and hitting power with the mobility needed to support rapid armored advances. Crews appreciated the more modern chassis compared to the M12's converted tank platform, along with improved ammunition stowage and crew protection. The vehicle remained in American service through the Korean War, where its ability to deliver heavy fire from positions that towed artillery could not reach proved invaluable in the mountainous terrain. Continuing with rocket artillery, a field where American innovation produced devastating weapons, the rocket launcher T-34 Calliope mounted 60 launch tubes on the turret of an M4 Sherman tank, creating a mobile multiple rocket launcher capable of saturating enemy positions with high explosive. The launcher assembly consisted of 36 permanent tubes in the upper rack and 2 jettisonable groups of 12 tubes each below. Each tube fired a 4.5-inch M8 rocket armed with a fin-stabilized projectile containing over 4 pounds of explosive. The complete 60-rocket salvo could be fired in approximately 10 seconds, delivering nearly 260 pounds of high explosive across the target area in a devastating barrage. Maximum range reached approximately 4,100 yards, though accuracy decreased significantly at longer distances. The launcher assembly connected to the tank's main gun barrel through a pivoting arm, allowing the rockets to follow the same elevation as the 75mm cannon. The entire rack elevated and traversed with the turret. The Calliope takes its name from the steam organ that features similar parallel pipes, historically associated with Mississippi riverboats and circus music. The weapon was developed in 1943 and intended for bunker busting during the D-Day landings. However, the launcher significantly raised the tank's center of gravity, making it unsuitable for transport on landing craft in rough seas. 30 M4s of the 743rd Tank Battalion had T-34 launchers installed to assist a planned offensive in December 1944, but the German Ardennes offensive interrupted these plans and the launchers were never fired in that operation. The Calliope eventually saw combat in 1945, employed by the 2nd, 4th, 6th, 12th and 14th Armoured Divisions as well as the 712th 700, 53rd and 781st Tank Battalions. Though not particularly accurate, the psychological effect of a full salvo proved devastating. The shriek of 60 rockets launching simultaneously terrified enemy soldiers, often inducing them to flee before the projectiles impacted. German troops learned to recognize and target Calliope-equipped tanks, making the distinctive launcher array both an asset and a liability. The T-40 whiz-bang mounted 20 tubes for the larger 7.2-inch rocket on a Sherman tank chassis. This heavier projectile delivered greater explosive effect per round than the smaller M8 rockets used by the Calliope, though fewer could be carried. The T-40 saw limited combat use in the final months of the European War, supplementing conventional artillery and reducing German defensive positions. Finally, we have coastal and specialized artillery, the massive weapons that defended American shores. The 16-inch gun M1919 equipped the most powerful coastal defense batteries constructed by the United States during the interwar period. These enormous weapons could fire a 2,340-pound armor-piercing shell over 25 miles, theoretically capable of engaging enemy battleships before they could bring their own guns into range of American ports. Batteries mounting 16-inch guns defended vital harbors along both coasts, including New York, San Francisco, and the approaches to the Panama Canal, though they never fired shots in anger during World War II. The guns were mounted in heavily protected concrete casemates, with magazines buried deep underground to protect ammunition from enemy bombardment. Crews trained constantly to maintain readiness against the expected naval attacks that never materialized, as Axis naval power was contained far from American shores. American artillery demonstrated remarkable variety and capability throughout 4 years of global warfare. The lightest mortars accompanied infantry into terrain where nothing else could follow, dropping explosive rounds behind enemy cover with portable weapons that required only 2 soldiers to operate. Field howitzers formed the backbone of divisional firepower, with the 105mm M2A1 becoming so ubiquitous that 1/5 of all American shells fired during the conflict came from its barrel. Heavy artillery at corps and army level delivered crushing bombardments that shattered defensive positions and interdicted enemy movements far behind the front lines. Anti-tank guns evolved from the 37mm door knockers of 1941 to 90mm weapons capable of defeating any enemy armor by 1945. Anti-aircraft artillery protected ground forces and defended the homeland, with Bofort's 40mm and 90mm guns forming defensive networks that made low-level attack increasingly suicidal for Axis pilots and brought down thousands of V-1 flying bombs over Antwerp. Self-propelled guns kept pace with armoured advances through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, and into Germany, delivering fire support wherever tanks could go. Rocket launchers added area saturation capability that terrified enemy soldiers with their distinctive shrieking salvos. From the 60mm mortar that infantry squads carried into the jungles of Guadalcanal to the Black Dragon howitzers that cracked Japanese bunkers in the Philippines, these weapons represented American industrial might transformed into instruments of victory. They fired shells ranging from 3 pounds to over 2,000 pounds, at ranges from a few hundred yards to more than 25 miles. The men who served these weapons played a role no less vital than the infantry and tankers they supported, delivering the firepower that made American ground operations possible from Tunisia to Tokyo Bay. Their legacy continues to influence artillery development decades after the final shots of World War II echoed into silence in August 1945.